So hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Melanie Robinson, and I'm the Global Director for Climate Economics and Finance at the World Resources Institute. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Bigger and Better in Baku, Scaling Up Climate Finance for Developing Nations. And as the title implies, we're here to offer an inspiring yet practical discussion on how to scale up climate finance to the levels that developing countries need. And I'm pleased to be joined by such a distinguished panel of experts to share their reflections on this critical issue. I'll be introducing you to the panel shortly, but first, if you'll forgive me, I'll say a few opening words as to why, as DBRI, we are running this webinar today. So we all know that in the next 5 to 10 years, all countries in the world are going to have to get onto a different development pathway, a different economic pathway, one that is low emission, climate resilient, nature positive, and inclusive. And that is an incredible challenge. That is a huge economic transformation of the type we have not seen, perhaps, ever. And for advanced economies and China, this will be challenging, but possible to do with their own finance and the finance that they can attract internationally. But for developing countries, even though a lot of the effort from them will be domestic, setting the mission, the ambition, the policy framework, driving their own finance behind that direction, they will need international financial support to make that transition. And for the world, making sure that those countries get that financial support, it's not only the just thing to do, but it's also essential for reaching our climate goals. Because NDCs that are due to be updated by February next year, for developing countries, the ambition in those NDCs will very much link to how much finance they think is available internationally to see whether they really can transition in a way that will be supported and create jobs, growth, livelihood, and support their countries. So the amount of public finance and private finance that's available internationally is going to matter for these countries' transitions and for the ambition that they can set. Now, how much finance is needed? Well, we have the G20 International High-Level Expert Group report that gives us some pointers as to the amount of money needed for climate and nature by 2030. And they point to 2.4 trillion overall, 1.4 trillion of that from domestic sources, so the lion's share, but 1 trillion of it from international public and private sources. And that's split roughly half, so about 500 billion from public international finance and around half from private sources. And half of that itself is mobilized by the international public finance. So at its core, there is a huge international public finance piece of this. And why is that so important? Well, the international public finance that comes to developing countries is central to de-risking and blending private finance. It's incredibly important providing those concessional resources where private money won't necessarily go. It's essential for giving the highly concessional grant finance where the outcome is mostly a social and environmental rather than an economic good. And that's particularly important for adaptation, or where it's necessary for just transition, project preparation, or to avoid unsustainable debt. And that international public finance, when we talk about that, we're talking about both bilateral and multilateral. And of course, that multilateral finance comes itself from contributors, from the shareholders of those multilaterals. And why are we having this conversation now? Well, partly because we're during the annual meetings, and I will circle back to that. But as the title suggests, because we're now only a few weeks out from Baku, from the COP29 negotiations, and the centerpiece of COP29 will be the finance negotiations, the new collective quantified goal, or NCQG. And this is the first time since Copenhagen in 2009, when the world is coming together to say, what are the contributions going to be to developing countries to support their climate transitions? Now, I should note that these agreements are part of a wider set of conversations and agreements and directions that have been given already this year and will continue into next year. Here we are, many of us in DC at the annual meetings, and MDB reform and recapitalization is an absolutely central part of this discussion. So innovative sources of finance, whether there's a task force working on tax or solidarity levies. So are enhanced ways to mobilize private finance, where there are many working on that issue. So are issues of debt relief and restructuring, and indeed the role of domestic actors, including governments and national development banks. So there's a longer arc that will go around Baku, and whether that's the MDB meetings, the Finance in Common Summit at the beginning of next year, Financing for Development and Seville, culminating in COP30 in Belém next year. But we do want to pause here again to think about Baku, because actually the agreement that is made there will be a cornerstone agreement in terms of that international public finance in particular. And that will be essential for really framing and providing a touchstone for the other parts of the agreement. And it will be incredibly important for the signals that it sends and for the trust that it can build. And so in this webinar, we'll be exploring those different sources of finance. How can we get to that 1 trillion needed by 2030 of international public and private finance? What would it take to get there? How can this be unlocked so that we can meet our climate goals? So in order to do that, I'm delighted to introduce our panel. So first we have Hans-Peter Lanke. Hans-Peter is the Deputy Chief Executive and Managing Director of the Overseas Development Institute. Then we have Karen Matheson, who's the Project Director at the Centre for Global Development. Kevin Gallagher, Professor of Global Development Policy, Boston University, a member of the Task Force on Climate Development and the International Monetary Fund. And last but not least, Gaia Larson, the Director of Climate Finance Access, Climate Economics and Finance Programme at the World Resources Institute. Okay, so as a reminder, this programme will be recorded and emailed to all the registrants later this week. After a moderated discussion, we're going to take some questions from the audience, which you can submit via the Zoom Q&A function. But now, without further ado, I'd like to begin by turning to my colleague, Gaia. So Gaia, what shape are NCQ negotiations in ahead of Baku? Everyone wants to know the top line numbers, and we're curious about that. But additionally, what shape does the goal seem to take? And how can we think more broadly about climate finance sources against needs? Over to you, Gaia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melanie. And I think there will be some slides if someone might be able to tee them up. But in the meantime, I can say that, well, as we head into Baku, there's certainly some nerves going around as to how we will be able to come up with a strong and ambitious but realistic goal. And I think there's also some hope and some feeling that it is possible. So there are, of course, excuse me, those that have been feeling a little bit disheartened that there doesn't seem to be a lot of progress on the negotiations so far. But I do think we need to think about it as in negotiation time, there's still quite a bit of time left to come up with a language that everyone can agree with. And there is a lot of behind the scenes conversation about how do we get to a goal that is acceptable to everyone. So the slides here that I'm going to go through, and you can go to the next slide, are going to explore not really how big the NCQG goal should be. That is something that the negotiators can come up with, and it'll be, a process of consideration of a lot of different elements. But one thing that we can do is look at, well, what are the needs for developing countries and how can we potentially put together different pieces of the puzzle, including the NCQG, to meet those needs. Some of you will probably recognize this graph from the high-level expert group, where they have looked at and estimated how much money should be going to developing countries externally to enable them to meet their climate mitigation and adaptation goals. There are a lot of different assessments out there as to the needs of developing countries. Most of them, show that the needs are in the trillions. But what this report does is it does break it down into sort of one way of thinking about how we could reach that goal. So we're just going to use these numbers, and you can click one more time, two more times. Here, these two numbers on the bottom, which are the public finance focus numbers, to use this as our goal for now, because we don't have an NCQG, and to say, okay, regardless of what happens with the negotiations, we need to try to get 500-ish billion to developing countries in external finance over the next years. So how do we go about doing that? And so next slide. Now, there are different pathways in which we can reach, of course, different degrees of ambition. In this slide, the little bar on the left today, that represents what is reported most recently in the OECD reporting on the 100 billion goal. And for those of you that pay a lot of attention, you might say, oh, but that was 116 billion, and this was less than 100 billion right here on this little, but that is because we have taken out the mobilized private finance, since here we are specifically focusing just on public finance. Of course, private finance is vitally and critically important, but here we're looking at the public side and what we can do to maximize public contributions. So today, again, is from the OECD report. That report is actually from covers money in 2022. So built in is a pretty conservative estimate as to where we would go if we didn't make a lot more effort. We just kind of went on the glide path. This includes 40 billion in addition to what we have now from MDBs. This has already partly been met, as has been seen in the MDB's most recent report on climate finance. And the other parts of it would come from a conservative estimate of additional funding that will come from the MDBs based on the reforms that have already taken place within those institutions to increase the availability of finance. And then the 10 billion here from non-traditional donors. This is, I should say within the NCQG negotiations, that's definitely not built in. Of course, that's a very hot topic, and what exactly will be counted and how and for who is a different conversation. But here we're just looking at how do you get money and what money is already built in. Well, non-traditional donors are already providing money, right? China is already providing resources. There have been several different recent reports come out recently that had to estimate those resources. And so here's just a number to recognize the fact that that money is already flowing. So next, click one more time. Thank you. So that's just built in, those last two. This one is where we start to have to work a bit harder. And here, especially the MDBs and bilaterals, because those are really our workhorses when it comes to figuring out how to get public finance to where it needs to be. So on the MDB side, we have here a need to be more ambitious and more willing to take an additional risk in the reform process in order to bring in additional finance and in order to make the MDBs more able to lend at higher volumes. And then we also have here built in a capital increase, right? So additional paid in capital to the funds to boost the amount of lending that can be provided. And then $50 billion from bilaterals. This is mostly from from traditional donor countries, but also a little bit from non-traditional. And it is essentially along the glide path of increases in bilateral international climate finance that we have seen over the last decade. So it is not a huge jump, but it is, of course, a substantial increase from what we have today. Now, final one. To get to 500 billion, we got to get innovative. We got to get creative. And this is where this last piece comes in, is the innovative financing, that new sources of funding, either through different types of taxes, levies, perhaps in a new approach to debt relief, bringing in the climate element there as well, to really boost up to 500 billion our contributions from the public sector. I have one more slide, I believe, so let's go to that one. Right, so here, on the left side, we have that strong effort bar, where we're showing on the bottom what we already have today, and then the middle blue is what's built in, and then the top lighter blue is what we have to do to get to a goal of 500. As you'll see, it's basically broken down largely between the MDBs and the new approaches to finance. So on the green portion being both the reforms of the capital adequacy framework, such as new approaches to callable capital, increased use of hybrid capital, etc., and a capital increase from the shareholder countries. So these two, looking at estimates, they can together, at about an equal share to each of them, reach fill on this green section here. And the yellow section would be from the innovation sources, the new proceeds from taxes, etc. Bilateral comes in down here in the purple. And here again, it would primarily be from traditional providers of bilateral assistance, but also some non-traditional. And this is not necessarily the only way we could get here, right? If we had a big push in bilateral financing, that could eat into some of the other parts of the funding pie here. But if we look at the political realities at the financial institutions and then within developed countries, this may be this breakdown may be one realistic way of looking at how we might reach such a goal. So we have a lot of really interesting experts on the panel who can delve more deeply into each one of these, the MDBs, etc. So I am going to hand it off back to Melanie to take us on.
Thank you so much, Gaia. That's given us a really great overview of where we are at the moment and what might make up the contributing parts of the finance to get to that 500 billion international public finance. I will come back to you on the NCQG specific, but I think that's teed us up really nicely. So I'm going to delve in with our panelists into each of those parts. And I'm going to start with the debt part. That is was one of the included in one of the bigger parts of the pie chart there. And I think has been less talked about recent discussions. And so I want to come to Kevin Gallagher on that. And firstly, just give us the right framing here. What are the right factors to consider when you think about the relationship between climate risk, climate action, and debt? So kind of locate us a bit in that space. And then what do you think are the leading options for dealing with debt distress in a way that allows for climate action? What are the most significant ideas and which ones are likely to gain traction? And is there, do you think, a chance of a more comprehensive approach in addition or following the more bitty approach that we're seeing in the system at the moment? Over to you, Kevin.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Great to be on this panel with these distinguished panelists and great overview, Gaia, for the issues that are at stake here. I'm on the International Expert Group for Debt, Climate, and Nature, and tomorrow at noon we'll be releasing our report on these issues. And so I'll summarize some of the key points. And I think the big thing about debt and climate finance is that public and private debt, it will be essential for mobilizing finance for this transition, but it has to be done in a very careful manner. And there's sort of three different ways to be thinking about it. One, when it comes to mitigation and energy transitions, debt should and could be the key driver there. But the key thing is not just the headline number. And I think that's something we really need to talk about and make sure is a big part of the NCQG program, is that it's really about making sure that the interest rate, the weighted average of the interest rate on all your financing is lower than the projected growth rate of the economy that's going to get all this new debt. And unfortunately, that's the reason why there's so much debt distress, especially private sector financing has been so expensive that it's tipped the scales and make many countries in debt distress right now. So not only is it important to mobilize a stepwise increase in public and private financing, but it has to be long run and affordable. So that's on the mitigation and energy transition component of it. For the most climate vulnerable economies, it's worse. They're stuck in a vicious cycle of debt, climate, and nature because they're vulnerable to begin with in geographic areas that are the most susceptible to the costs of climate change. When there's a climate event, they have a natural disaster, and many of those countries are too rich to get the very cheap financing from an IDA or something like that. And on top of that, when there's a climate event, they're seen as more risky. So the cost of capital for those countries goes up really high. And so they have to borrow at exorbitant rates to be able to try to build back. And the last thing they can do is build back better. And therefore, when there's another climate event, they're even more vulnerable and they're stuck in a serious, serious cycle. So for those countries, we have to come up to, we have to face the music here and realize that debt has to either be very low or pretty close to no cost for those countries. And one of the key problems in the architecture is that, especially when it comes to the bank and the fund, they still discriminate on the price of capital based on the income of the country, not the relative vulnerability of the country, and not the kinds of investments that are needed for the transformation. So those are the two big categories, but then there's another category. There can be big countries that need to have a transition. There can be smaller countries that have vulnerability problems, but for one reason or another, sometimes because of climate change, sometimes because of sanctions, sometimes because of interest rate shocks in the global north, countries are going to default. And the problem with that regime is that the regime that we have around default that was put up around the G20 called the Common Framework is not aligned with our climate and development goals by any stretch of the imagination, despite the fact that every country in the G20 has ratified the Paris Agreement. The underlying debt sustainability analysis that underpins a debt restructuring does not incorporate the need to be able to respond to climate risks, nor the need to be able to mobilize the financing for climate and development. Rather, it just gets you back to the level of anemic spending that got you into the debt distress in the beginning. So that's sort of the overview, the way to think about it in terms of framing. In terms of action, there's a lot of action that can happen in the next couple of years. So right now, the International Monetary Fund is reviewing its debt sustainability analysis for low-income countries. It's making some steps in the right direction about thinking about climate change, but our community really has to make sure that they get this right. Number two, obviously, on Thursday, the G20 will release a roadmap for MDB reform. Hans Peter's organization was the lead expert for making that pillar better, and our center was the lead expert for the G20 this year on making it bigger. And in our case, we really think that in all the ways that Gaia laid out, we need to maximize the recommendations of the capital adequacy frameworks, and we need serious capital increases across the board. One of the things, there'll be a host of new studies that update the IEG and all these things that you cited, Gaia, earlier. This will all come out on Friday of this week. And one of the things we show is still, yes, we're behind on mobilizing that capital upwards at $300 billion. But if we use more hybrid capital as a bridge in the first few years, we can still get there. It's going to take some time for MDBs to increase their capital. Largely because some of the major shareholders are really dragging their feet, and there's a lot of electoral uncertainty related to that. And many of the MDBs feel like they've close to maxed out what they can do in the CAF when it comes to low-hanging fruit. Since we're talking about Baku, and I'll end here, and CQG, it's of vital importance of the UN to recognize that we need a stepwise increase and that the MDBs and the International Monetary Fund have a key role to play here. And it's also important that they recognize and be very loud that it's not just the size of capital, but it's the cost of capital. And third, just to make sure that there's ambition, because with the G20 roadmap gives an envelope, but we really need to make sure and hold major shareholders and some of the largest economies accountable to make sure these institutions get transformed in the way that they need to be done and in the urgency that it needs to be done. Sorry if I went on too long.
No, that's great, Kevin. I just want to push you for a little bit more on the debt side of things. We'll come back to the MDBs with Karen in a moment. But I hear a lot of talk about whether we have a liquidity problem or a solvency problem. And of course, it will vary by the types of countries you've just laid out. But some are saying, well, it's really liquidity issues, so we can just bridge over, we'll get out the other side. And others are saying, no, there's a fundamental solvency issue in some cases, and we're going to have to solve this debt problem eventually. And we will need a new deal, if you like, between the main debt holders, China, the bondholders, the MDBs, to get us through this solvency issue. Can you help us think about that?
Sure.
Liquidity versus solvency, and how you need to tackle each. Yeah.
Sure, it's both. It really depends. It really depends on the countries. Some countries just are, they're tight, fiscally squeezed. They can't really borrow any money over 7%, which is what the markets are signaling right now. So those countries need a shot in the arm in terms of liquidity, and they also need development finance. I think the key issue here, the key thing to solve the debt problem is growth. We need a new growth path that is robust. It's low carbon, socially inclusive, and climate resilient. That is the key to get out of our debt problems. So there's a certain set of countries that need liquidity shots in the arm, coupled with some temporary debt suspension and long run development finance. But there's also a huge number of countries that are effectively insolvent. We basically saw that with the case of Kenya, where folks thought that they really had a liquidity problem and that all it would take was a little bit of a liquidity injection and a World Bank loan, and that might bring them back to markets and get them back on a path. Well, it did bring them back to markets at 10.35%, which is completely unsustainable, which is kicking the can down the road for further debt distress and perhaps a default. And obviously, it put the youth of that country on the street, and there was a tragic outcome there, which is a problem. The key thing that our community needs to be really thinking about is that this debate over who is illiquid and who is potentially insolvency is completely blinded because the World Bank and IMF's debt sustainability analysis ignores the climate and development financing needs that are there. And so it's really hard to tell. What we learned is that if you make a mistake like we did with Kenya, you can make things go backward. And so we really need to reform the debt sustainability analysis, make sure the climate and development are core to that. And then we can say, not only is a country necessarily solvent or illiquid to be able to get through the week, but to mobilize the financing for the long run that we need. We did a study, I'll put it in the chat. I'm a part of a group called Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery, and we redid the debt sustainability analysis for the LIC countries. And we say that if you really were baking in climate risk and mobilizing the finance that you would need, that there'd be upwards of 47 countries that really need that would be insolvent under those. I'll put that in the chat. So there are many countries that are illiquid. There are many countries that are insolvent. The fund and the bank think that there's not that many insolvent countries because they're not coming to the common framework. They're not coming to the common framework because that gives you a massive credit rating downgrade, and it takes 2 years to get through, and things are so bad on the other end. And then no country's really gotten any effective debt relief after that. And that's why they're not going. It's not because they're doing better.
So fascinating, Kevin. I have many follow-up questions, but I'm going to leave it there. I'm sure our audience will also have questions on debt, so that I can turn to Karen. Karen, it's already come up a bit this morning that the MDB is absolutely central here. Gaia talked about how we get so much leverage from finance we put in the MDBs that they've got to be an important part of the solution. Kevin talked about the importance of the type of borrowing that you can get from MDBs, especially the more concessional. So tell us, what do you think about how things are going in terms of the MDBs? Do you think that what Gaia said is already in the pipe, as it were, is correct? Or is there already more that we can squeeze out of the CAF reforms and what we're already doing? And if you were in charge of the MDBs over the next few years, not saying there's a vacancy, but just imagine, what would you be pushing for in terms of what more the MDBs could do, or what you'll be asking for the shareholders to get that trebling? What would it take?
Okay, thanks, Melanie. I'm gonna. That's a tough one. But starting with the earlier questions, the speaker set this conversation up beautifully. So thank you. I would say, I guess it's sort of a glass half full situation. So the good news is, look, the MDBs have really been expanding their lending capacity. And if any of you heard Secretary Yellen's curtain raising speech yesterday, she said that just based on the financial measures they've been taking themselves, with no help from donors, you've got about 200 billion in additional lending capacity over 10 years. Now, that's obviously very small relative to the 250 annually, but it's a big figure, particularly because there's definitely potential to do more. somewhere between 160 billion to according to one credit rating agencies, up to almost 500 billion. So there is scope to do more, but the further you push, the harder it gets. Each additional dollar is harder and harder as as the MDB risk assessors get a little bit anxious about just how far to go. But they have really, I think, been responsive to calls to do more with what they have. Of course, not all that is for climate, by the way, right? That's just the overall lending increase. But climate funding is also going up. And the MDBs themselves put out a report saying they've done about 75 billion in 2023, and that's a jump of 45% from 2021. So we're still far from where we want to be, but that is a remarkable scale up, particularly for organizations that are considered kind of large, unwieldy, bureaucratic. They're moving. And I think what we've seen over the last 4 years is a real substantial increase in sort of the internalization of the importance of this. And as many of you may know, shareholders have been pushing the MDBs, particularly the World Bank, but also even the IMF, as Kevin said, to really include climate as part of it. It's fundamental to its mandate. And I, someone who's been around a long time, I would just want to underscore that that's important. That's a notable development. But now for the but, and this also really gets to the point that Kevin was making. All of this funding it doesn't all come on the same terms. Different countries can access different terms. And so, Gaia noted in her slide that the estimate for the need for concessional funding, for cheap funding, is also 250 billion a year. That is incredibly scarce. That is the really, really, really hard funding to get. And it would be hard under any circumstances, extremely hard. But now in particular, you have tight budgets, and you have a lot of other needs, Ukraine, for example, that are sucking up a lot of time and attention and funding. So that is really where the challenge is. It's not so much the volumes, I think that's some, and we'll get up there, but it's the terms, just as Kevin stressed. So a lot of the funding that I just talked about, this big increase in headroom of around the 200 billion, that's on market terms for the World Bank. Now, when I say market terms, it's still cheaper than what a lot of countries could get on their own. So if you're a middle income country like Indonesia or Brazil, you can go to the World Bank and borrow for climate at cheaper rates than you can do at home, potentially. Not always, but often. But it's still debt that you're taking on. So what happens to all those countries that really need cheap funding, and they can't get it from the markets? They don't have that option. They have to depend on donors and the MDBs almost entirely. Those other sources that Gaia mentioned aren't really available. And I just want to spend a minute emphasizing this. So right now, as many of the audience probably is aware, the World Bank is wrapping up its big fundraising effort for the poorest countries, okay? 78 of the poorest countries. And the envelope they're aiming for is 100 billion. And that is very, very ambitious. It's never been hit before. But that 100 billion is going to have to address the development needs of the 78 countries that have access to this pot for 3 years. And it includes everything, including, adaptation and climate. So in that sense, that's where I think you see a real scale of the gap becomes clearer, is when you're talking about the poorer countries. And I'm just really glad that you were emphasizing, Melanie and Kevin, the debt challenge, because now you have a lot of these poor countries and, their domestic sources of revenue, other sources of revenue, they're all going for debt payments. So So they're really put in an impossible situation of having to make, impossible choices. So that to me is where the biggest gap is. So what would I do? So a couple of things. The first thing I would do is I would really push for the reform of the climate architecture. Melanie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because, yeah, the World Bank and the MDBs, they're one piece, but you also have these special climate facilities, the climate investment funds, you have the Green Climate Bank, and they have different resources at different terms, and it's very disparate. And when we're in an existential crisis like this, I think that the time that's really needs to happen as a starting point, particularly because it is so hard to get more money out of the donors right now. I mean, I would absolutely push on that, but I know that Ajay Banga and everyone else, they're pushing incredibly hard. So they're not missing any trick. They're doing what they can. I think per Kevin's point, I would focus very, very intensely on the debt and look at any kind of incentives that the MDBs could provide that would help support a much more efficient workout process, and then going forward a much more sustainable path. And that's a pretty general response, but no one has found the silver bullet yet there, but that's absolutely for sure. And then I would push on the MDBs to do more on the risk mitigation, risk tolerance for the private sector, because I think Melanie flagged this at the beginning. Again, when we're looking at the big emitters, mostly big creditworthy countries, their big need is mitigation more than adaptation. I mean, the good news is the private sector can come in here and play a major role, but in a lot of cases, they're too risky. The projects might be too risky. And I think there's a lot of space there. And it's easy to say this from the outside, but I do feel like the MDBs could be more risk tolerant. I'd love to hear Peter's thought on that, particularly on equity. They do a lot of debt. They don't do that much equity, but maybe doing some sort of a huge equity pool for first loss, where they have some first loss. MDBs could pool these instruments so you have diversification of risk. So doing a lot more on that side, I think, would be really important. And then finally, just in terms of measurement, one of the things I do worry about a little bit is we're looking at climate funding, but the real question, of course, is, well, what are the outcomes? And so just having a better handle on the link between the funding and the impact on emissions in climate mitigation, and kind of impact on resilience when you look at adaptation. So that to me is also a gap, and there's been some progress, but I think we still have a ways to go. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Karen. And if we have time, I'm going to circle back to you to ask you a specific question about how big the capital increases have to be for the MDBs to get us to trebling. You may not have the number there, but I'll give you a bit of time to get on the back of your envelope and scribble that. So I am keen to get to Hans-Peter and pick up this private sector question, but first I want to finish on the public funding. And a brief one for you, Gaia. You mentioned that innovative finance, that word always used when we're not quite sure how we're going to get it, will be important. But you flagged there international taxes, or sometimes called solidarity levies. And there's been a lot of talk in the last year about those, from maritime levies, which actually many have signed up for, all the way to wealth taxes. Can you just say a bit about actually what the scope is to raise funding here, and perhaps a few of the thoughts about how that affects equity? Thanks.
Sure. Well, of course, the scope depends on the level of ambition, even in terms of the taxes, right? So we do actually see, as you mentioned, some countries have signed up for certain things. There is an aviation tax for some countries in Europe, and it does create some funding, but it's not the type of funding that will move the needle, right? So what we really need is the the type of agreement where a large number of countries come to the table and are willing to, in some way or shape or form, whatever it might take, be it a tax on wealth or a tax on shipping or whatever it might be, to agree, first of all, that the funding will be collected, right? It's through this process. And then second of all, how will that funding be distributed? And that isn't necessarily automatically, it's not necessarily automatically the case that all the money would go to something related to climate, let alone climate in developing countries, right? So that is kind of part of the challenge here. Now, if we do have agreement amongst lots of different countries, and the agreement gets implemented, then there is a substantial opportunity to potentially raise a lot of money, right? In the hundreds of billions range. But and again, questions around where that money would go, but it's definitely a place where there is an opportunity to bring in really that important capital that Karen was talking about, right? The concessional, this isn't market-based funding that we're bringing in, it's actual dollars that can be used for grants and other things. So there's a ton of opportunity, both in terms of the amount and the type of funding. Now, how to get there is a completely different question, and brings in, as you flag, equity issues. So on the one hand, this is clearly a question of equity. How do you get funding from wealthy or the industries that the wealthy use, for example, aviation, to those that are suffering from climate and don't have access to the resources they need? So it's meant to be a wealth transfer to those countries and those people who need the finance. Now, there are also some other equity issues that are coming up, which is in part why this process isn't as easy as, I was about to say as easy as one might think. Probably nobody thinks it's that easy, but nonetheless, around, even the process of collecting this funding, how will it impact developing countries? Will it actually have a negative impact? For example, if we raise through the IMO process, there are developing countries who are saying, I don't know if we want this shipping, these shipping fees and taxes, because what impact will it have on food prices, etc. So there are layered elements of justice and equity in here that have to be considered when we, when we pursue these solutions.
Thank you, Gaia. And sitting here with all the finance ministers in DC at the moment, we don't underestimate how hard it is to get people to think about international tax when tax is usually a sovereign issue, and to think about hypothecation of tax, which we know is something that every treasury in the world hates to do. So there are a couple of very fundamental barriers there. But thank you for flagging the volumes and the other issues. Now I'm going to come to Hans-Peter now on private finance, because we've touched quite a lot of the public finance. And Hans-Peter, we've talked about how the G20 expert group has around 500 billion needing to come from the private sector by 2030. But this area, it feels, has been notoriously difficult to get to work in recent years. So many efforts to mobilize private finance, to think about different tools and instruments through which we can do that. So can you give us your insights? How do we get to that 500 billion? What are some of the most important actions, tools, and instruments that are going to get us there? And where should we really be focusing our gaze and our effort on this one?
Thank you, Melanie. Can you hear me? Good. Okay. Great to be here this morning, and great actually to listen to the colleagues here on the panel. I'm already learning a lot. On the private side, you're asking some very simple questions. So let me take those up. It's perhaps useful just going back to what Gaia had projected in her slides. That was the public money. She showed a slide about the total gaps from the independent high-level expert group, and then the public side of the money. The 500 billion that was there, you have to see the private money is filling another 500 billion gap on top of that. And those are incremental numbers. All of those were incremental, so on top of what we experience today. And with private flows, need to be aware that they have been incredibly volatile. So what does 500 really mean? If you go back about 10, 12 years, the private net credit flow into all emerging markets and developing countries was on the order of 400 to 500 billion a year. Today, so the last numbers we had, that flow was negative. Yeah. And if you take sort of the last 5 years, it was sort of hovering between 100 and 250 maybe. So we're well below, even if we take sort of longer run averages, well below the net credit flow from private sources that we had 10, 12 years ago before others, when sort of this whole thing was put on the agenda that we needed to mobilize. So something hasn't quite worked out there. Yeah. If you then add other types of private funding, so foreign direct investment, for instance, those have been more stable. And if you add equity flows and other things, then still the total has declined from probably about a trillion plus, a trillion, 1.2 trillion, to something on the order of 700 billion or so. So we've lost $500 million. Now we're talking about we need to gain $500 million. Okay, so in part this puts it in perspective, but in other parts it shows that somehow this is something we don't have a full grip on. What's the main factor here in that volatility? It's the global macro environment. It's the Fed, the policy by the US Fed, single most important one. And on the recipient side, it's China. So a big chunk of these private flows are going to China, and then how much goes depends on conditions in China, and then the overriding importance of interest rates in the global environment. So those are the factors that are really driving the macro picture, and it's important to keep being aware of that. If one looks more granular into those flows, one big thing that you see is a decline in finance from global banks, so project finance, the kind of finance that is particularly important for transforming energy systems. Global banks have been cutting back after the global financial crisis, in particular because of new regulation. So Basel III, which came into play over the past decade, is putting a big burden, a heavy capital charge on finance of the type that we really want for the climate transition. And those have been cutting back in very large amounts. What you also see when you look at the more granular info is that the very deep pockets of funds, the ones that are very often referred to when we say, well, there's 100 trillion, there's 300 trillion, and we're only talking about this very little bit that we need here. Why isn't it coming? Those are institutional investors. A big chunk of that is institutional investors. And when you look at what institutional investors do, they don't invest in emerging market developing countries. If they do, then it is perhaps China. And maybe one or two others, Mexico, so occasionally. Everything else is vanishingly small. And that is if you take insurance and the funds managed by insurance, that is overwhelmingly due to regulation of insurance companies, so life insurance and like for where they invest their money under management, are subject to Solvency II regulations in the EU, the equivalent in the US and the UK, and they make it almost impossible for them to invest in sub-investment grade and long-term assets. And then on the pension fund side, which is another big chunk, it is behavioral issues. It is they're not quite subject to regulation in the same way, but there are sort of long-standing essentially habits in that sector, and it's hard for any one pension advisor, for instance, to put their head above the table and advise something that would seem more risky. It's hard to get out of those habits. And when you meet with those sectors, then what you realize is that's a completely different universe. The discussion that we're having here has nothing to do with their reality. We're very far away. Yeah. So there is a real gap to be bridged, and it's really useful to be granular. Now, let's go a step further to what Karen was alluding to. Can the MDBs do more about this? And yes, I think we all agree the MDBs could do a whole lot more. If you look at the IEG report, the Independent Expert Group report last year, they put that those figures on the table. They said that MDBs could actually quadruple the amount of private mobilization that they enable. So currently about 60 billion a year, mostly through the private finance arms of these MDBs. And that is through things like syndicated loans and certain platforms where they help to de-risk funding for private investors. Well, so the IEG says they can actually quadruple that. There's a whole lot more to be gained. And it's got to do, and I'm not going to go to the details, but with the way that they function in large measure, but also with sort of their understanding of what their role is. So into that environment, you have had attempts, especially since since 2015, and much of that, not only, but much of that from the MDBs and DFIs, into innovating sort of financial engineering, new ways of getting private finance alongside these MDBs, so to mobilize. And there's a whole lot that's been happening. As I mentioned, the traditional private finance mobilization instrument is sort of the syndication, what we call B loans with international commercial banks. That has not been moving much for the reasons I mentioned, regulatory. So the innovation has been more in other areas, has been attempts to tap those institutional investors. And it's been, if you look at what outfits like defense or other private sector outfits who are engaged in this area, what they have been advising, it's been that the biggest mobilization potential has been associated with measures that enable institutional investors to buy exposure to MDB originated assets. And that's around the standardization of assets. It's around the transformation of bank loans into capital market instruments. It's around the aggregation into large individual ticket sizes. It's around risk mitigation through diversification, structuring, or de-risking methods. Those are the four main directions that much of the innovation has taken that we see with the MDBs, with some effect. So financial engineering is good, has been good. We have to see a whole lot more replication. But then I go back to these aggregate numbers, and it doesn't seem to be moving the needle. We've gone backward, in fact, in the aggregate. So there is something much bigger going on here. And if we want to be effective with mobilization, we have to go beyond that, what I call sort of the middle part, which is the designing the financial channels with the engineer. We have to look at the supply side and at the demand side. And on the supply side, what we have are issues in the global financial architecture. Those regulations I mentioned too, Basel III is incredibly biased. There have been studies of that over the past 10 years, including by the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, that show that they are biased. The developing countries at the table, when those regulations are done, have not carried their weight. And so they tend to be category-based rather than risk-based, and you get outcomes that make it very expensive for banks to invest in, to finance these things. There's the solvency regulations, very similar. There are a bunch of other types of regulations. There are taxonomies, EU green taxonomies, for instance, that actually become an obstacle to financing transition assets in developing countries. And 80% of all the assets that we're looking at would be transitioning assets. So there are things that we have to look at on the supply side, and a lot of them have to do with regulation, with taxonomies. There are also behavioral factors that I alluded to with the pension funds. And then on the other side of this is what's going on at the country level. And when you talk to MDBs and you ask, what's your main problem? Is it that you have too little money to finance these projects in these countries? They say, no, that's not my problem. My problem is that there are no projects. There are no bankable projects. So we make all these assumptions that are in these big numbers. There's all this need for finance because all these investments have to be made in renewable energy and in the sustainable transport and all those things. And we sort of assume that those are projects, but those are not projects. There isn't something that is readily available and bankable at the other end of this. Those have to be created. Yes, there are needs, but those project opportunities, those pipelines have to be created. And there's a whole lot more that can be done there. Including by the MDBs to what we often call unblock the upstream of projects. So the regulatory side in the renewable, in the energy sector, or in various other sectors. How can that be made to support investments in those sectors? And then the simple hands-on project preparation support, the development of projects where in many countries there is limited capacity, even in some of the middle-income countries, there's limited capacity. Just think about municipalities. A lot of the investments that we're talking about, especially in adaptation, will have to be in a municipal environment. I think the built environment will account for some 70% or so of global emissions. Well, so those investments, municipal authorities are, notoriously weak capacity. Only 2 or 3% of municipalities have a credit rating, so financial management is very underdeveloped. So for them to be able to develop those projects that we need, and where the finance is then meant to go, they need help. The MDBs can help, and others can help. So let me stop it there. But this is what I think in the next 5 years, where the next push has to be, not so much on the middle bit, the engineer. We've done quite a lot. There are methods, but on the supply side, regulatory, and nobody wants to touch that. It seems like the third rail of finance is that you don't touch regulation. That's wrong. Yeah? And then on the project side, where there has to be a whole lot more help to actually generate those pipelines.
Brilliant, Hans-Peter. Thank you. So clearly articulated. That's really excellent for us. So I want to come back to Gaia to talk about non-traditional donors, and then Kevin, I do want to ask you the question I've got Karen scribbling on the back of an envelope around the amount of size of capital increases we need for MDBs. She may have a number, but I know you've also been working on this bigger piece of the MDB, so I'd love to get your views. But first, Gaia, you did comment on the flows that are already going from non-traditional donors, South-South flows, and that those are quite significant already. You noted that this is a topic of discussion on the NCQG, but can you tell us a bit more? I know you led the work in WRI looking at what it would look like to expand the contributor base and how significant that could be. Please give us a few more insights on that side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So anyone who has paid any attention to the NCQG negotiations knows that this is a hot topic. Basically, the traditional donors want to feel that there is an expanded responsibility, and that therefore relatively newly wealthy countries, that they also contribute in some way to the goal. So here, the question is in part about getting more money, right? So of course, the Chinese, who should I call on? The Qatar people, the people of the government of the UAE, others, they do already do investments, for example, in renewable energy in the Middle East. We at WRI did a study on China recently where we found that over the last 10 years or so, China has been providing around 4.5 billion per year on average although that has been decreased recently in the last couple of years. And this money does, of course, help to fill in the needs and meet the needs of developing countries. But we should also all remember that it is not the silver bullet to raising a lot of money. These institutions will contribute, already do contribute, and if they're counted within the NCQG, then that could increase the number, by however many billion we want to say, but definitely, within the $10-20 billion range. But it's also a political issue and a feeling, I think, within developed countries that there is more leverage for them to go to their own legislatures or whoever it is that holds the purse in their country and to say, look, we are not the only ones contributing. There are also contributions coming from China, from the Gulf states and elsewhere. So, we should be able to kind of increase our contributions accordingly. So this is essentially a multifaceted way to both ensure that there can be an agreement in Baku that every country can live with, right? And also a way to increase the funding, both from the non-traditional and from the traditional donors. At least that is the idea. And that how that works out is complex in part because of course, countries like China and others, they still see themselves, and rightly so, as different, right? They see themselves as not in the same category as countries like the United States or the European countries. And so there's question is how to recognize that difference still, so that these countries are satisfied, but at the same time bring in their resources so that the developed nations are satisfied. So hopefully we can find satisfaction, if not happiness, for everyone in Baku.
Thank you very much, Gaia. Right, final question, then circling back to Kevin, and then we have a lot of great questions come in from people attending the webinar, which I'll start to field to each of you. But Kevin, yes, can you enlighten us on what size of capital increases you think would be needed for the MDBs to get to that trebling? And I'll also ask you to comment briefly on the SDRs. And there's been a lot of enthusiasm about SDR rechanneling as a way to find a good source of finance. Do you think that's promising? What could that look like? Thanks.
Sure. If I could just start by underscoring what Gaia just said, I think it's really important in Baku to make sure that the global community sends a loud message that climate finance is not a zero-sum game. This incredible study by WRI that uses a little bit of our GDP Center data shows that China, despite being a developing country and far from one of the major historical emitters, is one of the leaders in climate finance. And in the most recent FOCAC summit, they really put their money where their mouth is in financing a lot of green energy in Africa. It can't be seen as a zero-sum game. So as I mentioned, a number of new studies will be coming out on Friday about the MDB roadmap. I guess I'm allowed to give a little bit of a sneak preview on some of this stuff. Like Karen said, on some measures, the glass is a little bit half full here. There have been some capital increases over the past couple of years, relatively modest, but as Mia Motley says, the needle's moving in the right direction. And also there have been a significant amount of capital adequacy framework recommendations implemented. I think the studies that come out on Friday will show that in terms of CAF, there's about $357 billion new dollars that'll be out there. That doesn't include the new World Bank announcement, and so that would bump it up to 387. The IEG did say that we need about 300 billion in terms of new capital. We've adjusted those estimates downward because there's been some new capital increases already, and so if interest rates stay low, what's needed is around $255 billion. that is only 0.1% of the annual government revenue of G20 members. So, but I'll underscore that while the dollar amount is actually small, the geopolitics around that are and the domestic politics and some of the major shareholders is really tricky. What we propose in our new study that comes out on Friday is that a key bridge to this is to have more ambition when it comes to hybrid capital. And if the MDBs took the recommendations of the IEG report and used the levels of hybrid capital that was recommended in there, we estimate actually that you'd only need, if interest rates stay low, upwards of $60 billion in new capital across the entire new system. That's only 0.03% of the government revenues on an annual basis from the G20. So it wouldn't cost that much. Unfortunately, the major shareholders are being difficult on both ends. They're being reluctant when it comes to capital increases. And one of the big things that happened this year, to get to your SDR comment, is that in May, the International Monetary Fund ruled that special drawing rights can be used as hybrid capital. However, many of the major shareholders are reluctant to get in the game. Karen's Institute put out a great blog piece being loud about that this week, saying that countries need to step up and play a role in rechanneling SDRs for hybrid capital for development. For use in the development banks. The the Inter-American Development Bank and the African Development Bank have key proposals out there to use this, but countries just aren't stepping up to do that. So what is one other way to do it? If taxpayers aren't willing, if the major shareholders aren't willing, what's really loud and at the center of Bridgetown 3.0 is a new issuances of special drawing rights in between now and 2030. The IMF showed that the $650 billion worth of issuances was very, very helpful. Countries use them to deal with their own credit problems on a bilateral basis. Some of these were rechanneled. China was a real leader in rechanneling about a huge amount of SDRs to help create the Resilience and Sustainability Trust at the IMF. Others were rechanneled for other trust funds at the IMF. And so this proved it was very useful. But if we're not going to open up any doors in these other spaces, the SDRs are a way that aren't going to cause global inflation and aren't going to dethrone the dollar, but can help really mobilize financing for climate and development in a way that its way has been really proven. And so I think this is another thing we need to hear in Baku. If countries aren't going to step up with taxpayer money, the SDRs are a proven tool to move forward. And there's lots of calls and lots of momentum on that right now.
Yeah, let's keep our eyes on that ball. Thank you, Kevin. Peter, did you want to come in on that? Hans-Peter, sorry.
Yes, if I may, can I just supplement what Kevin said, which I think puts the numbers really in good relief. I want to make a pitch for regular capital, okay? Because not just because it's the most valuable as such of the various forms of finance, but also because it can be leveraged. The World Bank estimates that they can leverage it by over 10 years. But also because we have a governance issue with the MDBs, with the World Bank and particularly the IMF, where countries have countries' voting rights are well below their economic and other weight at this point, and there's a erosion of sense of legitimacy of the system, and as a result, with all the stuff we're talking about the MDBs, we should expect developing countries, major developing countries, to be a loud voice for these changes. They're not loud enough a voice. And if you talk to Brazil, if you talk to India, South Africa, and you ask them, why aren't you much louder? Yeah, it's in part because they say, well, look, it's not actually, we're not controlling these entities, and it's kind of wrong. You go back to the founding of the World Bank and IMF, China and India had a much higher share of the vote than they have today. Yeah, it's gotten eroded essentially by Europe, I have to say. So And a capital increase is an opportunity to adjust a regular capital, to adjust those things. So not only don't we need much, so Kevin said 60 billion, think about it, this is over 10 years, right? So it's this is at least the way that the numbers framework is working. Over 10 years, so it's 6 billion a year. And of that, there is a share, I don't know, Kevin, if you calculated that in there, which can be brought in through retained earnings, especially from the private arms. So the IFC, which regularly makes 1.5, 2 billion, sometimes $3 billion in net profit a year. Yeah. And some of that can be brought in through those private arms. So it is not much money. It is extremely valuable money. It's important as a symbolic and sort of a legitimacy act for the international community to put these institutions where they belong.
Thanks, Hans-Peter. And I'm going to start to draw on these questions now as well. I'll come to Karen. And Karen, you and I were involved in the 13 billion capital increase paid in 2018, a combination of general, where everyone pays according to their share, and selective, which Hans-Peter's just talked about, which changes the shareholding. If you think about that 13 billion in 2018 paid in, we've heard from Kevin about the need for perhaps 60 billion. What does that look like in terms of paid in capital, the cost to the exchequers in developed countries? Do we have those numbers, or are those a bit tricky to calculate because it depends on interest rates and exchange rates and goodness knows what?
Yeah, I mean, the real challenge is it depends enormously on the institution. Different MDBs will have different paid in capital rates. But look, just to give the audience a sense, we're talking maybe between 6 and 10 cents on the dollar. So it is incredibly efficient. You know, Hans-Peter is absolutely right. There is no more efficient way to increase capital resources than through support for this part of the MDBs. But I do just want to stress that you are talking then about that funding being provided at market rates. And, you know, Hans-Peter noted that when you ask governments and MDBs, you know, is there demand you're not meeting? And the answer is actually no, not really. And that's true as well at the World Bank right now. They still have quite a bit of excess capacity. So then the answer, then you need to find out, okay, well, why? What's holding back demand? And one thing is absolutely the project pipeline. So it's tremendously important to do that upfront investment. And again, that's hard because that costs money and it's dollar for dollar. You can't put in 6 cents to get a dollar's worth of a feasibility study, but that's super important. And then the other thing is terms. And part of the big agreement around the World Bank Evolution Roadmap of the last year was that middle-income countries themselves should be able to access cheaper terms for climate projects and other projects that have a clear global benefit. So there was an agreement in theory. The problem is the funding isn't there. Or if it is, it's tiny. It's maybe, I don't know, somewhere between 20, 50 million, which won't take you very far. So if you're, say, you know, a Turkey and you're trying to, or a Bangladesh, or more middle-income countries trying to choose between a coal mine, which is very inexpensive, and investing in renewables, which is a little bit more expensive in the near term. You know, the theory is the World Bank should be able to potentially cover the difference to make that incentivize the country to invest in the renewables. But that money that would fill that gap, that's what's missing. So between that and the sort of lack of project pipeline, the challenge is actually not so much on the size of the MDBs, but on these other issues.
Yeah, very useful. Thank you, Karen. I'm going to turn to Gaia now to some of the questions we've had from people tuned in. The first one is a clarification. So one of our listeners is saying, are you saying the gap between the 500 billion and the 1 trillion needed of external finance is private finance? Is that what the G20 report is telling us? Please, can you clarify that? And when we think about additional bilateral funding, we've got a question here saying, from your perspective, what should be the balance of grants versus loans in there? So question for you there, Gaia. And while you're answering that, panelists have a question about the role of country platforms. So if any of you has got particular insights on country platforms, I'll come to you on that one. But first, Gaia.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so we're basing the $500 billion figure on the high-level experts group report. And if it's not already linked in the webinar chat, we should make sure that it does get linked there. And that report does say that it's approximate, and you'll see there that there are some ranges, but that that the need for in developing countries, not including China, is around 2.4 trillion per year. About 1.4 of that will come from domestic sources within the countries, right? And in some countries, that'll be a lot of their resources will come from domestic resources. In other countries, it won't be that much. Of course, there's variation. And then the remainder is $1 trillion, and that trillion is representative of funding that should be coming externally into developing countries to help them with all the remaining needs. And around half of that, so around 500 billion would be public, as we've been talking about today. And then the other 500 billion would be private, again, international private funding, so coming from other places. And some of that international private funding would be mobilized by public funds more directly, and others would be kind of less closely tied to efforts by governments. So yeah, that's what the report said, and there are, and in terms of, wait, sorry, what was your second question, Melanie? Remind me.
Of balance of loans and grants and
Yeah,
bilateral funding. But
that.
sorry, Guy, just to add it adds to it's links to some of the other questions people are asking. I can see in the questions we've got, a lot of people are saying, well, why can't we just make all this finance grant if there's such a problem with debt distress? And, you know, why do we need loans at all? And I wonder if you could pick up some of those threads of other speakers where they've talked about why loans actually are quite helpful if you're in a productive investment, and the Karen's point about how precious grant is. So if you try to put grant into places where you can get a return, you're sort of wasting precious resource, and help people think about, well, why not just grant for everything?
Yeah. So yes, as you say, so why not grant for everything? On the one hand, I mean, if money was just everywhere and there was plenty of it, then grants for everything, I think, would be fine in a way, right? But that's certainly not the world we live in for a variety of different reasons. And so we do want to make sure that this international funding that we have is used most effectively. It can go as far as we possibly can get it to go, right? And so doing, we need to recognize that there are places where you don't actually have to give them a grant, right? You don't have to provide the money and then never receive any of it back again. Instead, you can provide a loan. The loan allows a recipient to make money in some way, shape, or form, or have an income, or in some way bring benefit that enables them to then pay back the loan. This is the theory, right? And so in paying back the loan, that money goes back into the coffers, and it can then be distributed again to a different country who needs the resources. Whereas if you just give a grant, the money never comes back, and then it can never be redistributed. I mean, I think that's a simple way of thinking about it. And thus it's useful to figure out, okay, where can I provide loans, right? And where do I need to provide grants? And that's the real question that needs to be answered. And where, and there are a lot of places that do need grants, right? And especially in the countries that don't really have an active private sector, where they are dealing with mostly adaptation issues, not mitigation per se, because mitigation tends to be, those investments tend to have more of a financial return than many adaptation investments, right? So there are plenty of places that need grants or highly concessional money funding, and then there are other places where it's okay, arguably, to provide loans, because then the money comes back and it can be, the pot gets bigger, right? If we were to just provide loans, then it would be very difficult to get, I mean, very, very, very difficult to get to the 500 billion goal. So that's why we work through this process of figuring out where money needs to be going so that we can maximize it.
Thanks, Gaia. And I think that it's very pragmatic. What kind of finance is needed for what kind of investment, and how do you make the money go as far as possible? And recognizing that that doesn't quite answer the perhaps more moral and justice question, but on the basis that unfortunately we don't have limitless grant available in the world, how do you make best use of it? That's very helpful. Now, I do want to turn to these questions that are coming up around country platforms. I think it takes us to look at the country level. And some of the panelists have already referred to the incredible importance of the growth pathway, the green growth pathway that countries are choosing, and the ambition and vision they have there, the policy reform, policy environment that is there to help drive that, making the country attractive for investment and making sure that all finance that goes in is used well. And then the need to bring financing together as a system at the country level. And here at the annual meetings, there's a lot of talk of country platforms. We've got a session later today at WRI launching the TF Klima Expert Report, talking about that and how we need finance to work out as a system at the country level to support countries' own plans. Would any of the panelists like to tell us your views on country platforms and what role they can make to ensure at the country level that finance is working as a system? Who feels that they've got something to say on that? Hans-Peter, go for it.
Yeah, and you said so. The Task Force Klima report is coming out. What today is it? There's tonight the G20 finance ministers are going to approve that package of that Kevin referred to, the roadmap, and then there are a number of papers, Kevin's papers, and the ones that ODI prepared. One of which is focuses on country platforms and the role of MDBs, and so that's captured in the roadmap. There will be some pressure now, if you want, on the MDBs to help develop more of these country platforms to be supportive in this regard, and many of them already are. So that's coming. There's a lot of I think problem of defining what a country platform actually is. Many different views about that and expectations, but at core, at least the way that they're set out in these papers for the G20, they are just a mechanism for allowing at the country level to organize your potential financing sources around fairly concrete, very sector-based investment plans, moving from a tailored individual financing source to individual project approach to something that is more programmatic, where you get sort of funders buying into whole programs of activities, and that has a number of implications, or at least that's where country platforms can be useful. They can be useful in making in aligning, harmonizing ESF, environmental, social frameworks, which differ across MDBs, and that's always a problem, slows down things. They can help to align strategies of these institutions behind a country-led approach for, say, the energy sector or for agricultural adaptation. We heard some countries are thinking beyond the sort of the JETP climate mitigation type approaches, and are looking at these country platforms as ways of also organizing funding for more sort of core development and adaptation areas. So it's useful to view those as instruments that can help countries implement their plans by organizing international finance behind it.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. Let me just see. We have so many good questions here. Let me go to Kevin. One of our questioners is saying that they agree with you that we need a new path of growth, but it seems that we haven't been able to decouple economic growth from higher emissions and environmental burdens. Are you able to say something about this new growth paradigm and what it will take in developing countries and indeed other countries in the world to develop that, so that there is something that this investment can go behind, which will deliver that return that you talked about?
Well, we actually have decoupled the energy intensity of growth. That's been coming down significantly across the world, and that's a good sign in the right direction. But it is core that we can't separate climate change and prosperity, and sometimes these are depicted as a false trade-off. And if done right, not just thinking about reducing emissions or financing adaptation, but if these new investments that we're all talking about, these is a stepwise level of investment around the world, and if done right, it also can help foster economic growth. The International Monetary Fund has a couple great models that show that this could be transformative for prosperity across the developing world. And so there are a lot of examples in terms of the high emission countries of really reducing the energy or emissions per unit of output. The problem is that the level of the reduction in intensity has thus far been slower than the total scale of economic growth, and that's why emissions continue to go up. And then there's all these new countries that are coming on that are starting to industrialize, and they're also taking a bite out of it. So the ingredients are there. I'll be with Karen and say half full, but I think one thing to put that question in a larger context is that we can't put all this on the international financial architecture, the MDBs and the World Bank. I think, excuse me, the MDBs and the IMF. Unfortunately, because there's been so little movement on implementing Paris and on regulating our financial system so that it supports productive, low carbon, socially inclusive and resilient development, we're asking the MDBs to do all this stuff and de-risk, et cetera, and that's just not fair. And I think another loud thing at Baku is that we need regulatory environments within our economies to make sure that financing goes towards low carbon, productive, and socially inclusive growth paths. And this is an area that we really have to be careful about, especially in the US and in and around New York, where maybe 3 or 4 years ago at Glasgow, many of the private sector firms were really on board this. But now the firms themselves, in part because of their own interests and also because of the pressure that they're having, they're really scaling back. And the only way to really get private sector financing in the right way is to make sure we have the regulatory environment so the incentives for investment are to go towards good investments and not to speculate on the differentials between interest rates in countries and hedge against all these things. That's the problem. What's incredible is that from 1980 into the present, the size of the financial system has increased by orders of magnitude. It used to be about $10 trillion. Now it's upwards of $300 trillion. But the level of investment in the world has stayed stagnant around 20% of GDP. And so we need to have an incentive structure to make all of this pool of finance to go towards productive investment.
Thank you, Kevin. And that's a great way to finish us off. I do want to wrap up our webinar now. Unfortunately, we are at the hour. I want to thank our excellent panelists. You've really given us, from Gaia at the beginning, showing us how that 500 billion of public finance that needs to go with the 500 billion of private finance by 2030 could be raised, to digging into each of those elements. You've given us a huge amount to reflect on and think about. I was really struck by the point where you finished off there, Kevin, which is that countries ultimately, if they're going to avoid further debt problems, they really need to be able to grow in that low carbon, climate resilient, inclusive way. And they need the finance to be coming to them in a way that it's less costly than the benefits they get from that growth. So that fundamental piece at its core. We had really excellent messages about the MDBs, where I think half full is the conclusion of this panel, where a lot has been done to raise more capital and to reform, but there is more that could be done around hybrid capital, normal capital, and SDRs. I think we heard that there are these new sources, hard to get, some equity issues to think about that, but international levies could play a role. And finally, I thought a really clear exposition of what's needed on the private finance, that there has been innovation to date on the financial engineering, but really strong message from many of the panelists on the importance of dealing with the supply side and regulation and to some extent behaviors, so that they really are supporting low carbon, climate resilient, inclusive development, and much to do on the demand side to really help with upstream regulation and project preparation. So that's given us a comprehensive set of issues that need to be worked on if we're to really get the finance mobilized. Here, we've heard about reports that will come out this week that are worth looking at, and then all eyes on the NCQG at Baku to see how that core international public finance and from what contributors can be put together to give countries confidence that finance is really going to flow. So thank you again to the panelists. A reminder that this has been recorded and will be available to those of you who have attended. And I look forward to seeing many of the panelists here today around the annual meetings and hopefully to engaging with many of the people who've attended our webinar today over the coming weeks and months, including in Baku. Thank you all and wish you a good day. Thank you.